Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, we encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, The Authority File Roundup, which keeps you updated on previous, current, and upcoming Authority File episodes. You can subscribe at choice360.org by clicking on the newsletter banner at the top of the homepage. Okay, so here's a question for you. What is the function of a library? Now, given who's listening to this podcast, that might sound like a rhetorical question, but my guests for this series have published a new book called Unpacking the Personal Library, The Public and Private Life of Books, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In it, they collect essays and stories that interrogate the meaning and purpose of a variety of libraries, like libraries at foreign embassies, or the personal libraries of authors, politicians, and poets. While doing so, we learn about the relationship between libraries and archives, how using digitized resources differs from wandering the stacks, and even what the value of libraries are to the great variety of individuals who curate them and visit them. Joining me are the co-editors of Unpacking the Personal Library, Jason Kamlott, Professor of English and Research Chair in Literature and Sound Studies at Concordia University, and Jeffrey Weingarten, Professor in the School of Language and Liberal Studies at Fanshawe College. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this second episode, we explore the variety of ways we can define a collection and the push and pull relationship between digitizing content and the contextual importance of physical books on shelves. Jeffrey, I want to jump over to you and ask you just to sort of, talk about sort of the glossary, so to speak, of collections you're actually covering in this book, and help us understand the kinds of libraries and collections you and your contributors are contemplating in the book, and how you define them.
Well, I think how we define them is actually one of the problem questions of the book, and I think Jason's rundown there of what he was doing with the Richler Library is a really good indication of just how unexpected the library can be. So one of the things I definitely love about the book is that it shows, I think, just how variously a library can take form. You have these intensely personal reflections in my section of the book, and in Alberto Manuel's section, where he talks about what he owns and how it's his skeleton, how it's a part of him. And then you have scholars talking about collections that they have perused. We have chapters on, William Osler's library, or Robert Duncan's library, or Sheila Watson, these writers or figures from history. So we have, I think, quite a few great examples in the book of what might be the most obvious example of the private library made public, where you have once private collections being shared in academic institutions or elsewhere. And then we have also nods to digitization in these discussions and its impact on collecting in a library. And this is especially, I think, obvious in Andrew Stauffer's piece. And this will, I think, resonate with anyone who's interested in collections and collecting, and then how that kind of intersects with digitization in today's climate. But then the book also, I think, introduces things that might not be so expected, a range of unconventional libraries that may not jump out as obvious examples of the library. So you have one that stands out for me definitely is Sharon Francis's chapter, which is on protest libraries, where you have Francis outlining the ways in which these discarded or remaindered books become completely useless to an institution, but then they're picked up by people who then create on, sort of spontaneously libraries on the street as part of a protest movement. So what an institution has deemed valueless and no longer needed is suddenly picked up by a different group who then says, actually, this is going to help us make our political or intellectual statement. And these libraries on the street, they become, the ideological like lifeblood of these movements, where you have these libraries being curated with the intention of sustaining this atmosphere of intellectual political protest.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that's I think a very unexpected and interesting example. And I think one of the things I was surprised about as we put the book together was how often politics kind of factored into it. I mean, I think Manuel talks a little bit about, the politics of destroying a library, and what that means, in history. And then Bart Vartour talks about in his piece how embassy libraries are also kind of cultural symbols of international diplomacy, that the
Yeah.
books we send overseas are kind of a picture of ourselves. But what I think all of the collections that we look at in the book, what they all have in common is they share elements of private collecting and then public access, and how the relationship uh, of the collection to a reader is just constantly changing. And what one will get out of the library is going to be totally different person to person. So
Mm-hmm.
someone might find insights into a person or into a place or an event or a particular time period even. And and I think what I said earlier is what's most interesting about the collection to me is that everyone in the book is saying kind of the same thing, which is that we don't know what we'll find in the library, that the meaning of the library is fluid,
Mm-hmm.
it's ever changing, and that means that whoever owns the books, whoever's holding the books, what the books mean, what they tell us, what they teach us is going to be very different. That it's not just a text to reader relationship. There's so many contexts to reading. And yeah, I think that's for me what's maybe kind of unifying in the book. But I think it's also interesting if Jason wants to jump in, just because I think Jason and I had so many intellectual overlaps in this book. But then sometimes when we talk about what we thought sort of stood out in the book, sometimes we'd say different things. So I don't know, Jason, if you wanted to add.
To add about what specific question?
Oh, sorry, just like what the collection means, what the collections and the range of collections mean
That are covered in the book.
in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I think our collection, we can get confused between the book collection, the collection of essays.
Right, sorry, collection of essays, I should say. Yeah, the essays.
But our collection of essays is quite broad in its display of its conception of collection, right? And the kinds of collections that we associate with libraries, ranging from, coherent personal libraries that are made public, to, bookstores that represent an individual's collection, of a bookseller who doesn't want to sell any of his books, so only lets people come and look at them, so it's actually functioning as a library. So I think, and everything in between, I think, as Jeffrey was saying, the book rehearses through a very broad range of case studies, this kind of dialectical movement back and forth between public and private, so that a prime minister's library can then become a kind of shrine, to the prime minister, that's publicly available for people to look at. There can be sort of imagined libraries that are set up in embassies. Yes, yeah. So embassies. So that unimagined, like what would a library of Canada be, right? So this kind of concept of like, okay, this represents Canada, this library, right? And then it's set up in an embassy. It's a completely sort of ideological construction of a collection, right?
Yeah.
As compared to other libraries of individual authors and how they actually use them to produce the works that we read and study today. So it's a real broad range. Yeah.
That's excellent. Jason, I'm going to stick with you for this next question, wondering if you can talk about sort of the knowledge and intricacies that physical items can carry. And then there's a connection to that with the spoken web project that you're involved with. I mean, maybe start with what the spoken web project is, and then
Sure. Yeah. So I was talking earlier about my sort of more recent interest, recent being the last 15 years, like in sound and
right.
sound media. Spoken Web is an international sort of partnership that is working on finding, digitizing, describing, and preserving audiovisual collections that document literary activities, in particular sort of events and performances, but also pedagogical activities, discussions in Canada. So collections that really document things that happened in Canada since about the 1950s. And they're captured for the most part on analog media like reel-to-reel tape, later cassette tape, and then all kinds of other things like mini discs and other media formats that had short lives, in between. And we're studying these materials in order to sort of, I guess, develop a kind of different, maybe even a counter literary history in Canada, one that's studying sort of what people did, what people said, around these literary works and how they performed them as well, as opposed to that which is available through the print record alone. So you could say that in a way we're developing a kind of alternative audiovisual collection or library of materials to the actual library of books that constitutes, Canadian literature as it's primarily understood and studied. Now, the question about the knowledge and intricacies that a physical item can provide. Let me go back to the Richler Library for a second. As we were unpacking Richler's books, and cataloging them, we did come up with sort of initial criteria that we thought, well, this might be relevant to future study, which had to do with traces of Richler in the actual books in the library, right? So we went a little overboard, perhaps, in our indexing and cataloging of these traces of Richler in his own library, so that we, beyond marginalia, which was of interest to us, if there was a page that was folded, if there was an insert in a book, we would actually index that and annotate that in our cataloging record of that book. So we were imagining that possibly for a researcher in the future, it might be of interest to find a trace of the agency of the author who owned the book, in these books themselves. But beyond that, as I was mentioning earlier, there's so much realia, so many other objects in this collection that are enigmatic. Like sometimes we didn't even know what they were, or if they were there, like there was a collection of canes. Why did he have these? There were all kinds of different jars. There were hundreds of matchbooks from different places, right? All of these objects had possible significance, but it's not obvious to us unless someone could explain to us what the significance of these things are, for us to unpack them. That's why I mentioned earlier, we sort of have developed an oral history project around the collection where we would invite people in who were connected with Richler to select a number of objects. We were doing sort of object-oriented oral history interviews where we would allow them to go into our catalog, say, please prepare these 10 things, put them on the table. We would bring them in, and they would tell stories about the things that were on the table and sort of unpack the significance of these. Just to give one example, Adam Gopnik, who writes for The New Yorker, who is a good friend of Mordecai Richler, came in and he immediately gravitated towards a photograph of a bunch of people who I didn't know who was there. I mean, I saw Richler in the photo, but I didn't know most of the other people. And he proceeded to tell an hour-long story about what was happening at this table, right?
Wow.
So objects often will have inherent intricacies of significance, but they're not always going to be evident to us. And I would say, going back to spoken web, the same is the case for these recordings of events, right? If we think of an event as a kind of entity that we're trying to catalog and understand, you may hear in a recording something happening, but you don't really know. They don't explain themselves. They're very noisy kind of artifacts, sound recordings, but they don't always explain themselves. So you're sort of listening and trying to understand, like, what's going on here? Where is this taking place? Who is speaking? Sometimes you don't even know. And so there's a lot of additional research that's required in order to really understand, the intricacies in relation to knowledge about cultural events that is inherent in a sound object or a material object, right? So I guess we proceeded with a faith that almost every object in this collection had some kind of story to tell. Some of them we're never going to unpack. It's not like these are sort of Anglo-Saxon riddle poem objects that can tell their own stories to us, right? So we have to find ways to expand the significance and unpack the intricacies of these objects by finding narratives and constructing narratives around them.
Yeah. That's excellent. So, Jeffrey, I wanted to come back to you. You mentioned sort of the process of digitizing content and kind of in some ways, the sort of existential dilemma around that. Can you talk about that push and pull relationship between digitizing content on a huge scale versus the contextual importance of a physical book located on shelves? And you said something interesting just earlier where, there's so many contexts to reading in a physical collection, and sort of that sort of discovery, and how a physical collection influences the person as they're kind of perusing it. But I'm curious to hear your take on the process of digitizing content versus that physical experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny for me because I always come to these kinds of questions with such a completely impractical book lover kind of approach where everything matters to me.
Right.
So I mean, what I would say is one of the big problems for me anyway with digital content is that I don't yet think we're at a point where it can replicate the experience of browsing.
Mm.
And I know that one can browse digitally, but it's a very different experience to kind of walk down a row and randomly pull books off a shelf and bring 12 books arms wrapped around them, sit down at a desk and start going through them just to see what they are. This is actually how I found some of the most important content for my first book that came out in 2019 called Sharing the Past, which came out with the University of Toronto Press. And what I was looking at was correlations between history and poetry and history and fiction, just how creative writers talked about history and how academic writers talked about history, academic historians. And at one point in the revision phase, my editor had just said, look, just take 6 months, do whatever you think you would find interesting. Like, just go to a library and just start pulling things off shelves. And so for 6 months, I mean, anytime I had a free hour or 2 hours, I just walked to the library. I would just go to a call number and pull off everything. I'm sure all the people hated me that they had to put entire shelves back up. But I would just sit there and flip through books and just think, like, this was something that I would never have thought to search for. It certainly would never have come up in my search terms when I was using a catalog.
Yeah.
And I ended up finding one passage in particular that's in the introduction of the book where a historian singles out one of the poets in my book as one of her major influences as a historian. And that this argument that I'd been making that was very, very hypothetical and felt sometimes a bit tenuous was suddenly completely validated, that historians actually were reading poets and they actually were influenced by them. So that experience of wandering was always very interesting. But also, I mean, you start to see the physical space almost like its own kind of language, that especially the call numbers. I always think of that scene in The Beautiful Mind where all the numbers are coming off the wall into his eyes and he's figuring everything out. It's kind of like that sometimes. I'm walking down the stacks and I see like a call number, and before I even see the title of the book, I'm like, oh, that call number is going to be about this. And so I'm going to pull it off. And you start to kind of read call numbers more than the titles sometimes. So there was always this kind of intuition I felt like I was developing the more time I was spending in a physical library. I don't know how strong a case a person can make to, someone budgeting, that you have to hold millions of books and make space because I like browsing. But I mean, just being honest, that is a case that, I think anyone who's ever done research in a library will understand that power of browsing. And I think there's just this split between people who get it and people who don't get it.
Yeah.
And I will say, though, that I think that this also kind of points to maybe a misunderstanding of what efficiency is, because we think of efficiency as always beneficial, but efficiency can also take things away from us. One of the things that I think is so symbolically important about wandering a stack, of books, is that I'm taking my time with my research. I'm not rushing. I'm not going just where the internet tells me to go. I'm exploring and discovering, and I don't know what I'll find. And I end up finding these unexpected gems. And I think that there is something, unfortunately, very symbolic about saying, well, instead of wandering and taking your time, use this search engine and look up the digital copies, and they'll all be right there for you at home, on your computer. There is something beneficial about that, and there is a convenience there. But I also think that we might give a little bit of thought to what we're telling people about what it means to actually peruse a collection.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say you've described like two very different ways of starting the process. It's sort of, it seems like in a digital collection, you kind of need to know those search terms. You want to look, you're coming up with very specific concepts that you want to see if you can find in a collection. And the opposite of that is perusing, in a physical collection where you're just kind of wandering to see what pops out. You don't have necessarily a very specific idea of what you're looking for.
Well, and reading books in their physical context, right?
Yeah.
So Margaret Atwood has this great anecdote about how she went to Harvard and decided she wanted to go and read more Canadian literature while she was at Harvard. And she was looking everywhere for the Canadian literature section, couldn't find it. And she found that it was next to the occult section at the back of the library. And she says for her, this made a lot of sense, that Canadian literature and the occult would be side by side. But, but there is something to be said about what that context tells us about how that literature is perceived, right?
Yes,
and
right.
I mean, I guess for me, it's like saying eating is just about getting nutrients into your body. Where like eating is a social experience, it's a sensorial experience.
Yeah.
And so is being in a library. There are smells, there are feelings. I always remember the side of which side of the page a quote was on when I go back to look through it. Whereas on the digital copy, I can never remember what it looks like.
Right.
Reading for me, it's very sensorial. And I think Andy Stauffer does say actually that, digitizing enables one range of approaches to libraries, but it also puts limits on other approaches that we might really value.
You just heard from Jason Kamlot, Professor of English and Research Chair in Literature and Sound Studies at Concordia University, and Jeffrey Weingarten, Professor in the School of Language and Liberal Studies at Fanshawe College. Join us next week as we take a deeper dive into Jason and Jeffrey's book and how, as it examines theories, practices, and philosophies of libraries, the academic library fits into their conclusions. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press.
There are actual university libraries, which are designed not to have redundancies. They're very and interlibrary loan and consortia across libraries within a particular city are really about avoiding those kinds of redundancies. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, as I was saying earlier, there are personal history is inherent even in academic libraries, so there are interesting things, and the academic library isn't just a source of sort of pure knowledge, based on you have this book and this book and this book, and that's what we need in order to cover that field, right? But they are cultural entities. They're fields of cultural interpretation in and of themselves.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.